Hey, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher, and you're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. Hey, welcome back to all my friends and listeners out there. You got Jim here. We are about to start my Bible study. It's about 6:30 in the morning, still dark. It's the kind of time that I like to study the Word because there's no one around. Wife's still in bed. Got my coffee here. It's nice and quiet in the house, and really gives me time to dive down into the Word. Yesterday was great, man. We started the study in Philippians where Jesus is declared to be God by the Apostle Paul as he writes to Titus in Titus 2:13. And in Philippians chapter 2, he actually tells you that Jesus is God. Now, Jesus has said this himself, that he's the Son of God, but now Paul is reiterating it for the edification of his Gentile believers. And when you look at the book of Philippians, just like the book of Ephesians, those books were written from prison in Rome. And both of those books are head and shoulders above Paul's other writings, doctrinally I'm speaking about. So these books are really meant for the soul of the Gentile believer. And keep that in mind as we go through this, okay? This is written specifically to Gentiles. If you open up to Philippians chapter 2, go down to verse 6, where Paul writes, speaking of Jesus Christ in verse 5, who, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. Now, try and keep in mind, and remember, when you get into these succeeding verses, try and remember who Christ was and always will be. He's eternal. He's sovereign. He created the entire universe. I know there's a lot of people that have trouble with that. I went to a church about 4 months ago where the pastor, first thing he said was that God the Father created everything. It's not what the Bible says. Jesus Christ, the Son, was God in the flesh. So consequently, in Philippians 2:6, he didn't feel that when he claimed to be God, he was grasping for something that wasn't his. He knew it was his. He thought it not a robbery to be equal with God because he was. And that's what Paul writes. He could rightfully claim to be God. Now, it goes on in verse 7, one of the great buts in the Bible, B-U-T. But as this eternal, holy, righteous, omniscient, sovereign God made himself of no reputation, he took all that stuff away. He took upon himself the form of a servant and was made in the likeness of men. He came to earth, took on flesh. Now, if you remember what the word servant in Greek actually was, it's the word doulos. And doulos in Greek is actually the word for slave, literally. So he made himself a slave. And of course there are various categories of slaves back then, but the epitome of slavery, at least back in ancient times, was the guy on the bottom part of the ship rowing the oars, right? Those were slaves. And, you know, they rowed until they couldn't row any longer. Their hands either gave out or they died, and when they died, they were thrown overboard. Just another piece of equipment. That's a bond slave. That's a slave. And there were other categories. Also, in Genesis 18, you show graphically how God would come down and appear to the fathers, the patriarchs, in human form. That's called a theophany. And in the Old Testament, that was a temporary thing. Right? He'd go back up to heaven, and as soon as he had accomplished whatever the particular purpose was for coming down and appearing, and in this case to Abraham, he would just simply disappear and go back to glory as the Godhead. But he still appeared to these people in human form, which was a precursor of Jesus Christ when he would finally come in the flesh, as Philippians 2:6 says and 2:7. In Genesis 18:1, it says, and the Lord, now that's fully capitalized, so that's Jehovah, God the Son, in Old Testament terminology. The Lord appeared unto him, Abraham, in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him, and when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground. Now, men have always looked like men, right? There wasn't a time when they had bulgy eyes or funny-looking ears. They've always looked like they do today. They don't have wings, or they're not glowing halos around their head. They look like men. Now, verse 3 in Genesis 18, and said, my Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. Let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet. That was an ordinary human occurrence. Humans' feet got dirty in ancient times. It was dusty. They walked wherever they went, so they needed their feet washed. And in verse 8 it says, he took butter and milk and the calf which he had dressed, and set it before them, these 3 men, and he stood by them under the tree, and they ate. All 3 ate. Now, one of these people is the Lord Jesus himself. The other 2 are angels in the form of men. But do you see what happened? They came down in human form. They came walking up to Abraham's tent. Abraham recognized them as human strangers, and as was the wont back then in Eastern hospitality, he fixed a meal for them. He didn't know that one of them was Jehovah God himself. And if you remember, it was the same way with Jacob. Remember, he wrestled with a man. He wrestled with a man, not some figment of his imagination. Jacob wrestled with a flesh and blood human being. But here at the tent, this man was the Lord in a temporary appearance, a theophany. But when you see his coming through the virgin birth, he's the same God. But instead of just all of a sudden appearing, he comes all the way through the birth of a woman as a baby. He comes through his childhood. He comes to become a man. He begins his ministry. If you read my book, Change of Heart, it tells you the entire process. It goes through his family life. It goes through him growing up. It goes through him going into his ministry. It goes through him working in Joseph's stone cutting business and carpenter business. He begins then to show the signs of his miracles, of his deity, of who he really was. Even Jesus is starting to catch on now that, there's something that he has to do. He was human. People could touch him. They could shake his hand. They could put their arm around him. They could eat with him. When he was out on the lake with those roaring waves in Galilee, he could raise his hand and say, peace, be still. And the wind died down. And the crazy thing, even more, in my opinion, than the wind, was the waves. Because if you've ever been through a storm on a big lake like the Great Lakes or the ocean, the wind can die down in an hour, but the waves go on for days. And he calmed the waves so they're like a pond. And it scared the dickens out of the apostles. I remember John MacArthur saying once that when that happened, the apostles were afraid of the storm outside the boat, and when he calmed the wind and the waves, they were very, very afraid of the storm inside the boat. What kind of man is this, that even the wind obey his voice? Well, I'm going to tell you what kind of man he was. He was God. It says in Philippians 2:6, he never stopped being God. He didn't think it robbery to be God. So he was found in the fashion of a man, right? In the womb of Mary, he was still God. As a little child playing on the streets, in his dad's carpenter shop, he was still God. At age 12, when they left him in the temple, unknowingly, don't forget, back in those days, Joseph and Mary and Jesus didn't just go to the temple alone on Passover. They went with a caravan. There's probably 60, 70, maybe 100 camels. And they all went to Jerusalem for the Passover. And Jesus at age 12 goes into the temple and he starts talking with the doctors and the scribes, and they're amazed at what this little kid knew and was saying and was asking. He was God. There's a cute little story that I made up, actually, between Jesus and his little brother James. When Jesus says that to his mom and dad, "Did you not know I must be about my Father's business?" His little brother James thinks to himself, "Well, I didn't know that Dad owned a temple in Jerusalem." Philippians 2:8. And being found in the fashion of a man, you couldn't tell he wasn't a man, even though he was God. When he was Jesus here on this earth, from all outward appearances, his daily activities, he wasn't any higher than any other man. He wasn't any lower than any other man. They were probably poor. He humbled himself, it says. The government authorities of Rome didn't humble him. The priesthood, the Pharisees and Sadducees in Jerusalem didn't humble him. He humbled himself. It was his free will. It was his volition. He brought all the pass. You want to see something? Go to Acts 2, verse 22. You'll recognize this as soon as you hear it. Peter preaching on the day of Pentecost. And he says, "Ye men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man." Now, bear this in mind. At this point, Peter doesn't call him a God-man. He says a man approved of God. You ever get that in the Bible? Have you ever stopped and thought about that? A man approved of God among you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God, in his whole triune being, of course, did by him in the midst of you, all throughout Israel. And you yourself also know. Most of them had seen these miracles. He, Jesus, being delivered to the cross by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. See, this is all programmed. God drew the blueprint that men would sin, that Jesus would be rejected. God provided the Redeemer. That Redeemer would go to the Roman cross. That was all the plan. And you, Israel, Peter preaches, by wicked hands have crucified and slain him. Now, I don't think Peter really, at this point, recognizes the fact that this is all the plan. To blame the Jews for crucifying Jesus, to blame the Romans, doesn't really get down to the crux of it. It was God. This was all part of the foreknowledge of God. Now back to chapter 2 in Philippians again. So when Jesus set his eyes toward the cross, on his own volition, on his own accord, although the entire Godhead was involved in the operation of it all, listen to what it says in Philippians 2:8. Being found in the fashion of a man, he humbled himself and became, he did this of his own volition, he became obedient unto death. Now, think about this. Jesus Christ comes down to earth, right? He's God. Does he know how to be obedient? Has he ever been obedient as God? If you're God, you don't need to be obedient, right? So becoming obedient is a skill that Jesus had to learn. Ever think about that before? I mean, you probably heard this passage 100 times. Being found in the fashion of man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death. But anybody ever bring to you the thought that he actually had to become obedient? He had to learn obedience because he didn't know it. So he was obedient to the death on the cross. Now, what I want people to understand is it wasn't just the crucifixion that made him unique, because thousands of people went through crucifixion under Nero. One time Nero had 2,000 people crucified and placed on the side of the Roman road, so that when people rode up and down the road between them with their chariot, they could see his power. They could see Nero's power. It went on for miles. Let this sink in. When Christ died on that Roman cross, every sin of the whole human race, from Adam until the last person, the last Gentile who becomes saved, and we go into eternity, was laid on him. That's why he was crying the night before. I don't think he feared the death. I don't think he feared the scourging, which he knew was going to happen. But here's a man who lived 30 years as God in a human body with no sin. And now the sin of every person was going to be laid on him. That's fearful. Just imagine, people, because we've been through this. We've been through Pol Pot. We've been through Kim Jong-un. We've been through Hitler. Imagine all the horrible sins of a man like Hitler laid on Jesus Christ, or Stalin. Every sin, every evil thought, every deed of a man like Nero was laid on him. Every wicked person you can ever think about in your mind, every sin was laid on him on that cross. That's what Paul means by the death of the cross. So nothing short of the power and the might and the holiness of an omnipotent creator could have even thought of doing such a thing. You know, a lot of people think of Christianity as a religion. You can call it that if you want. But I don't follow a religion. I follow a man. I don't think there's not another religion on earth that can claim to have all the sins of the world placed upon one man. Islam doesn't do it. Because regardless of what Muslims think, Muhammad was human. The Buddhist religion can't do it. The Hindu religion can't do it. Joseph Smith couldn't do it. The Jehovah's Witnesses can't do it. The Mormons can't do it. There's never been another individual that could ever come close to taking every sin of every human and have that sin put on them. That's what you got to understand about Jesus. Now look at 2 Corinthians chapter 5. This is probably something that you've never been taught before. That's what I like to do. I like to bring things to your mind that have never been taught possibly before. 2 Corinthians 5:21, for he, the God of verse 20, has made him, Jesus Christ, to be sin for us. In other words, God the Father made Jesus Christ to be sin, to take my sin upon him when he was on that cross, to take your sin, to take the sin of every human being, even the most wicked, to be sin for us. Guess what? He was made to be sin for us, who knew no sin. Of course, he was God, so he was sinless. But why? Why did he take all the sin? That we might be the righteous of God in him. That is powerful, people. That is so powerful. Now, go back to Old Testament now. Isaiah 52. You know, the last time I used this, I got messages from people who just didn't understand. They were so shook up because they never knew this was in their Bible. Isaiah 52:13 and 14. Write this down. And go study it later on. Behold my servant. This is Isaiah writing 1,000 years before Jesus was on the earth. And when the word servant is used here, that is DULOS, that is my slave. Behold my slave. Shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled, and be very high. As many were astonished at thee, his visage, his look, his outward appearance, what happened to him with his scourging, was so marred. He was so disfigured, more than any other man ever. His whole bodily appearance was so disfigured. No one could tell who he was. No wonder Mary Magdalene in the morning of in the garden of resurrection couldn't figure out it was Jesus. Put yourself in her shoes. That description in verse 14 is what she saw hanging on the cross when she left to go home. That's the mental picture she has as she's leaving of Christ hanging on the cross before Joseph of Arimathea put him in the tomb. And then to suddenly wake up and see this man standing, looking very normal. That's not what she saw when she left the cross. He had come back in his resurrected body looking normal. That's why she thought he was the gardener. But the sins of the world were all placed upon him, and that's what makes this verse in Philippians so ridiculous, so outstanding. That Jesus Christ was actually obedient to death, not just the death of taking his life as an ordinary crucifixion would do to a human, but when it says even the death on the cross, this is what I feel the Scripture is telling us, that his death was so horrendous that no one but the sovereign, eternal Creator God could ever attempt to do such a thing, but he did, for you and me. That's what makes Christianity so wonderful, above Islam, above Catholicism, above Jehovah's Witnesses, all that other junk. This is why no other, quote-unquote religion of the world can even come close. Because they got no one that can make the claim that Jesus did, that he had taken all their sins and put them on himself. The religions of this world are just puff, fluff. They can't make that kind of claim. They can't deal with men's sins. All it can do is evaluate man morally to see what his works are, to see if they can go to heaven. That's what Catholics do. They judge you with what you do on earth. It's a works religion. And we know God doesn't buy into that. All right, let's go to Romans. Let's end it up here at Romans 5. Just think. Christ did it all at the cross. All sins were paid for. He died, was buried, rose from the dead. He could have gone into glory just by believing that for your salvation. That's all you got to do. Jesus, 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4, Jesus died, was buried, and rose from the dead. And you're going to be saved just by believing that. All your sins, past, present, and future, were laid upon Christ. It's exactly what Paul means in Romans chapter 5 when he writes this. Moreover, the law entered that for the offense or the sin might abound. But where sin abounded, guess what? Grace did much more abound. So no matter how hideous the sin, no matter how hideous the sinner, no matter how heavy the sin load, everything was laid upon Jesus Christ and his death at the cross. And that's going to do it for today's teaching. Hope you guys enjoyed that. Hey, I'm Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher. You've been listening to the Bible Exposition channel. I hope you all have a great day, and God bless. Hey, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher. If you like what you hear, and you think your friends and relatives would benefit by the teaching, please share it with everyone you know. Thanks, and have a great day.